Hello and welcome to the BuiltOnAir podcast. BuiltOnAir is a regular podcast where we talk with everyday people and learn about the amazing things they are doing with Airtable. Today's podcast is sponsored by OpenSide, the leading solutions provider for Airtable customers. Check out openside.com to learn more about their products and services that can take your Airtable usage to the next level. Use promo code BuiltOnAir to receive $20 towards any product purchase.
In this episode, we're joined by Nicole Dyer, a professional genealogist, lecturer, and creator of FamilyLocket.com and the Research Like a Pro Genealogy Podcast. Nicole explains the ins and outs of genealogy research and how she's able to help people find out more about themselves and their family's history. But of course, this is no easy task. We get insight into the meticulous research she conducts and how putting together the pieces of the past can quickly result in over 1,000 data points. So, to ease the data collection process, Nicole uses Airtable to organize her research. We get a rundown of a couple bases she uses to collect the data and even how she begins to draw her conclusions. Nicole tells us all about the collaborative nature of the genealogy field, so it comes as no surprise that she's added templates of her research log bases to the Airtable Universe. Hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being on the podcast, Nicole. I have a couple of questions about what it is you do. So I know you do a lot of research with genealogy, and I was hoping you'd be able to give me and our audience a little bit of background about what that means.
Sure, no problem. So genealogy is just the study of your family history and finding your parents and grandparents and your ancestors. It's kind of like a mixture of historical research and learning about your family at the same time, kind of microhistory. You focus in really close on one place in time and try to figure out what your family was doing there and who their parents were.
Mm-hmm. So would you consider yourself a little bit almost like a time-based private detective?
That's a great way to say it. I love that, Camille. I think that's the reason why I love genealogy is because it is kind of investigative and you do feel like you're uncovering mysteries. I studied history in my undergraduate degree, and I really liked that aspect of history where you're researching and coming up with a new angle on something that already has maybe been written about, but it's kind of a new way of looking at it. And the fun part about genealogy is that a lot of the discoveries about your own family and other people's families haven't been made yet. So I get to do a lot of discovery when I research for clients or for friends or whatnot.
Sure. As we all know, there's so many different perspectives of, major historical events, but minor events or just even personal events have such a long-lasting effect on a family and then their extended network. So in your research, I'm sure it provides a great amount of, interest and in some ways closure for the people you do the research for.
For sure. A lot of people have unresolved questions, especially people who don't know a lot about their past or maybe were adopted. And some of the things I'll talk about later are tools that I use to help people who are using DNA to solve family mysteries. Maybe they don't know who their great-grandfather was or even their own parents. So they take a DNA test and then they use genealogy paired with the DNA evidence to come to a conclusion about who the biological family is. Okay. And often that can be painful, can be emotional, it can be wonderful. There's so many outcomes, but most people just want to know, just for so many reasons, but they just have this desire to know, their family history for medical reasons. They would just want to know where they came from, their makeup, biogeographical makeup, all those different things that people wonder about and want to know. And if you're not given that from your parents and you're not told, people have a lot of questions.
Yeah. And when it comes to just kind of everyone's individual story, for instance, my mom is from Los Angeles. I was born and raised in Los Angeles, but my dad is from Kansas City, and he's the only one from his family that lives in California. So there's a bunch of family whose history I don't really know because I just don't see them as often as I see my other half of my family. So the work you do is, even with living relatives, it's helpful, I would imagine, in enhancing a connection you might feel with your extended family.
Yeah, that's really true. There's a lot of connection that happens when we do our research about our ancestors and find these cousins that we didn't know before.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the DNA research that I do puts me in touch with all kinds of cousins I never knew before because we share some little parts of our DNA. And so we're put as matches in each other's DNA results.
So how does that work? If you have someone who's come to you and they want to have some research done on their family origin, obviously they can provide DNA samples, but how is it that you're able to connect it with DNA samples of people who are long since gone, or what is that process like?
A great question. So each of us carries the DNA inside of us from our parents. So we get 50% from each
Mm-hmm.
parent. And then we get a portion of our DNA from our grandparents. It's not an even 25% from each grandparent, but it's a range of about 15 to 30 or 45% from each grandparent. And it's kind of a random recombination with each generation.
Mm-hmm.
So you could inherit 40% from your grandparent and then 15% from your great grandparent. And so inside of your genes and your DNA, you have these little pieces that are from all your different ancestors. And then once you get back 5 or 6 generations, you start losing some ancestors' DNA because you can't inherit everything, right? You only
Sure.
get half from each generation. So there's other people who've taken DNA tests and they're all put into the same database. So if you test at 23andMe and you opt into the family matching, then they run your DNA results against the results of everyone else who's opted in. And they say, oh, you two have the same segment on chromosome 2 and 5, and it looks like you share enough DNA to be second cousins. So then you probably share the same great grandparent. And then you have to look at your, where you're from and who your parents' names are. And you look at kind of the paper records and you match up the paper records with what the DNA is showing and you try to find a common ancestor.
Mm-hmm.
So the DNA results don't tell you who it is. You have to kind of figure it out.
So that's where you, the detective, comes in.
Right.
So when you're doing that kind of research, obviously, like you just said, the amount that you inherit or the percentage that you inherit from one grandparent versus another grandparent varies. And so I would imagine it's somewhat difficult, I would say probably very difficult to come up with enough evidence, if you will, to say, I'm pretty sure that these two people are cousins, for instance. So obviously that comes with, practice and skill over time and, training in order to make those conclusions. But how long do you think it took you to be more comfortable with coming to those conclusions?
When I first started looking at DNA test results, I didn't really know what I was looking at. I would try to type in an ancestor's surname into the list because I have 90,000 matches.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would type in certain names that I was looking for and I would find some people, but I wasn't sure if we had the same ancestor and I didn't really know. But taking a lot of classes and practicing and learning from a lot of the books and the sources out there, and mostly just practice was really how I figured out what works. And there's a lot of experts, CC Moore, if you've heard of her, she's one of the investigative genetic genealogists who's been working on solving crimes. And she's done a lot of teaching. So I went to some of her lectures and she has a Facebook group. And then there's a citizen scientist named Blaine Bettinger who's got a Facebook group. And it's kind of this community of genetic genealogists where we go to these classes together and lectures and talk together on Facebook. And we've kind of built up the science behind it, through this citizen science, everyone trying it out and working on it and figuring out what works the best. And it's still such an emerging field that we don't really know what some things mean. And it kind of goes hand in hand with population genetics. And so there's just a lot of considerations. But autosomal DNA, which is the DNA we inherit from both of our parents and from our grandparents that I've been talking about, we're pretty sure now that we can figure out cases for people who are looking for unknown parents or grandparents within about 4 or 5 generations, usually. Mm-hmm. If it's 3 generations or 4, it's pretty sure we can figure it out. But getting back, the further you get back, there's the higher chance that you didn't inherit DNA from that ancestor. So it gets trickier.
Sure.
But usually we can get around that by just having more family members take DNA tests. So we'll say to our first cousin, hey, can you take a test? And we try to get more people. And the larger group that we have descended from that ancestor who we don't know their parents, the more likely it is that we can figure it out.
So that covers the more biological component of the research that you would do, but there's also the paper record component. How do you go about collecting all of this, written information? I mean, from generations past, it's not like we do nowadays where everything has tags and, is digital and easy to read. You have to deal with handwriting, and paper records deteriorate based on surrounding conditions. What's that process like?
In the last 10 years, it's been amazing how many records have been digitized and put online. And some of the people that are really at the forefront of that are Family Search and Ancestry, and a lot of state archives and countries who have archives are doing the same because they want to preserve their records. And so it's making it a lot easier for people like me to go online and research without having to go to the courthouse or go to the archive or go to the historical society in person. Although often we do need to get those records eventually. So sometimes it takes just calling or emailing an archivist and asking them to do a lookup, or hiring a researcher that lives out in Georgia or wherever I need records. But typically I start by doing research with all the records that are online. So a big one for Genealogist is the census records that were taken every 10 years in the US, starting in 1790. So those are a really big clue that we can use. And it's kind of fun because this year was a census year. So we all are kind of filling out our census in 2020.
Yes, as a side plug, I don't know when this episode will go up, but do your census. I'm an urban planner and we rely on that data a lot. Please do your census.
That's great. Yeah, I love the census. It's amazing, especially starting in 1850 when the household included all the household members, mostly, except for, it didn't include everyone. But before that, it only included the head of household. And so it was really not as wonderful. But starting in 1850, it was better. And then once we get to 1870 forward, it really included every person.
So you have your own podcast where you talk about genealogy and the work that you do. And you had mentioned earlier this larger network of people who do similar work and, help advance the field forward. Do you want to talk about how you started your podcast, what inspired you to share what you do, with the greater populace?
Sure, that'd be fun. So my mom and I are professional genealogists, and we started doing research together on our own family when I was a teenager. And so I thought about studying family history when I was in college. I actually went to the only college that offers a bachelor's degree in family history, but I decided not to do it, which I kick myself about now.
It's kind of funny.
I know, right? I studied history teaching instead, which I loved, and I taught middle school for a while. Mm-hmm. But I got back into researching genealogy, and my mom and I were kind of, teaching little classes in our communities, helping others, because it's just kind of a fun thing to do together with other people. And we decided to start a blog together. And after a while, we would talk on the phone for hours about it because she was studying to do her accreditation in genealogy and kind of get that, stamp of approval from an accrediting body that she was at the professional level. So I was picking her brain all the time because I want to do it too. And we were talking on the phone, and I love listening to podcasts. And I finally said to my mom, we should record these conversations that we're having because I'm sure other people would want to know what you're telling me too. Mm-hmm. So we just started one. And I had always listened to Pat Flynn's podcast, Smart Passive Income, just as kind of a fun thing because I'm interested in entrepreneurship. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of just followed his guide for how to start a podcast, and we just got up and running. So we're almost to episode 100 now, which is crazy.
Congratulations.
It's been really fun. I love it because I get to talk to my mom.
Oh, it's great that you do the work that you and your mother do helps people make or enhance their connections with their family. And it's almost like a family business, what you guys do. I think that's adorable.
It's very family focused.
All right. Well, with all of this data that you're collecting, you've made a base that helps you in your research. Do you want to share that with us?
Yeah, I can't wait.
Great.
Okay, so this is what I'm most excited about. It's a DNA research log. I was using a regular spreadsheet to keep track of all the DNA matches that I was working with on a particular case. And the list of matches got quite lengthy. And so I was a little bit frustrated because I was entering a lot of information about the match. And then I was having to enter some information about the emails that I sent to them, and then also entering information about the searches that I was doing for them. And I was doing this all in a very basic spreadsheet with multiple tabs. And I felt like I was duplicating my data entry because I was kind of adding the information about the match and their name and stuff to each table. So when I kind of had the idea that I could use Airtable, it was really kind of this like nebulous idea. I wonder if that would work. And then when I actually started using it, it was such a relief to just be able to enter the DNA match information once and then use the linked field to be able to see the match information and just expand the field when I needed to see like how many centimorgans of DNA do we share? Oh yeah, 35. And where is this match located? Oh yeah, I can click their family tree right here. So that was really great. But yeah, it was interesting because I was using Airtable in a volunteer position that I was doing for a genealogy institute that provides week-long courses for genealogists who want to learn how to do research better and they want to learn from the experts. And so as a volunteer publicity assistant for that group, we were collecting a lot of information for publicity and keeping track of a lot of things. And so I had used Airtable in that capacity and had seen kind of the basic way that it works. And I didn't really know anything about it. I just got thrown into this position and the person training me was like, here's what you do. You just use this and here's what it is. And I was like, oh, this is like a whole new world. I'm not familiar with database, usage really at all, except for when I go to ancestry.com and I type in a search request for a database. So it was exciting to be able to see the potential and then to make it work for me and to simplify kind of the data entry that I was doing.
Makes sense to me. So you have kind of it structured with at one table to look at your interactions with the people that you're researching. So do you mind switching over to that table?
Sure. So here's the correspondence log. And a lot of what I do involves contacting the DNA match and saying, looks like we're a match. It looks like we're about third cousins. And I need to know a little bit more about your ancestry so that we can find a common ancestor. So then they have to reply. And then I need to keep track of people that I've already messaged because I can send like 100 messages in one day. And I just kind of, because like I said, there's thousands of DNA matches. And trying to figure out how they're all related can take a while if we don't have some more information. So usually I'll just ask, if they don't have a family tree linked to their account, then I'll ask them for the names of their grandparents and then I can trace their tree back from there. So I need to keep track because if I send them multiple messages and they've already responded, I think that's kind of rude, oh, sorry, like I already contacted you. So I need to have like some record of that and their response and then where we contacted each other. So I'll put, this is the type of contact in this field. I've customized it so I can choose what, email or Facebook or the message system within the testing company, or maybe it was a phone call or a letter. Usually it's just within Ancestry message system. So this is just kind of something that I was doing in a spreadsheet that wasn't that efficient. Now I love it because I can group all of my correspondence by which DNA match I was talking to. And I can see specifically that I've sent 2 messages to this person and what they said back and just keep track of all that.
Yeah. And part of the issue with any kind of, task that requires you to contact people and you might contact them over multiple different websites or sources, whether it be email or through private messaging, sometimes it's hard to keep track of the entire conversation if you have to switch back and forth between, in your case, Ancestry to your email to 23andMe. So I can see how this would be a lifesaver in keeping a record of everything that has been said in one place.
Right. Yeah. And if I wanted to go see all my messages in just Ancestry, I could do that. But it's like you said, there's multiple databases. So in order to find all the relevant information for a case, we need to transfer the raw DNA results to the other companies and find matches there too.
Mm-hmm.
So that's usually the best strategy. And then the other thing that we do, the other thing that I need to do after I get some information back from the DNA match is extend their family tree. So I'm often doing research for them. And this is a really short example, but I'll show you a longer one. But I had to search for a certain person that's associated with one of the matches. So I can say it's match number 2, and I privatized their names because just for privacy purposes. So usually this will be a name and not a number. And so I'll put in, I'm searching for the parents of this certain match, and this is where I searched it. And so this is what a typical genealogy research log will look like. You have the date, the website you're searching, the URL, and then the source citation, which I haven't fully built for this one, and the results of what I found. So here's another example of a research log, and you can kind of see, let's see if I make these rows a little shorter. You can see like for some of the matches that I have here, I'm just doing more than one search, and I kind of need to see, I've done 5 searches on this match, and I was able to find his ancestors were so-and-so, and just kind of see at a glance what I've done. It's kind of like a mini research log for each of the DNA matches, and I can see it all within one table. So it's really useful for organizing a lot of data, which with these DNA research projects, it really introduces a lot more data than just a regular genealogy research project. So I have a lot more to organize and to kind of keep track of. And if I don't keep track of it, I'm probably going to do it again and waste my time.
Yeah.
So I've got to keep track of it. So you can kind of see how I've organized it by the name of the DNA match or the number here.
Sure. Do you use these bases to sort of build your own family tree, if you will, of these people and their families? There's like a couple blocks Airtable has that I think it's called like an organization chart, I think is one of the names where
I saw that.
Have you tried using that in conjunction with the research you're doing to kind of, once you've figured out who's who in the family, just kind of putting it visually?
Yeah, I was really excited to see that there was an org chart that kind of looked like a family tree block. And so I tried that out, and I put in some names and just tried to play with it a bit. It didn't quite work exactly the way, I mean, it works, you could do it, but it just didn't do exactly what I would want. So it was a little bit, it was kind of fun, but then I think practically I would rather build my tree with one of the tools that was meant for building trees, and that has record hint capabilities and the ability to really add in more data and events and things.
Ooh, we have a guest.
Hey, sweetie pie.
Okay, so yeah, it makes sense to use a tool that is specifically built for finalizing, the family tree. But would you say, the first part of your research, which would include this Airtable, gets you to the point where you can build that tree quicker or more efficiently or more accurately?
Definitely. I mean, that's the point, is to keep all the records organized so that I can build the tree and make the connections that I need to make. So yeah, it really helps. So I wanted to show you also in my matches table, kind of how I've got it organized. Sometimes I'll put multiple test takers here. And so sometimes I'll need to group by the person who's taken the test, because I'll have data from multiple people. Sometimes they have the same matches. So it's nice to be able to group by the tester and see, okay, here's all the matches that I've found for RGD, and then mostly I've worked with his data on this case, but then I also have some from his brother down here at the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
And then I've also done some work on the matches of another cousin. So it can be useful to put everything there, but then be able to separate it out too.
Right. And so I'm already seeing that there's a great many number of records that you would have to keep track of in order to do your work.
Not every case is this in depth. This is actually a really difficult one that I haven't solved yet. That's in my own family. So I'm constantly kind of building it.
Mm.
So we're trying to figure out the parents of my husband's third great grandfather.
Okay.
And we think that we have heard that he was an orphan. So we don't know if his parents just died really young or what happened, if he was given up for adoption, but we haven't found any research that shows who his parents were. So we're using DNA to solve it, and it's kind of leading us to this certain genetic cluster of people that we've been able to isolate.
Mm-hmm.
And so now it's just kind of up to building the tree, looking at all the evidence and seeing what we can find.
Sure.
So I've really been relying on my Airtable base to keep track of everything I look at.
So do you usually separate, let's say you have one base per case you're working on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like to do that. And that's how I was trained as a genealogist, was to have one research log spreadsheet for every objective or project that I was doing. And so some people like to keep a research log for their whole family, like maybe their grandparents, and they'll have a research log with everything about their grandparents. But that's not kind of how I do it. I just do it based on my research question, like who were the parents of so-and-so,
Mm-hmm.
or what was the identity of this person. And so I usually have a really specific question that I'm trying to answer with my log, and that helps me to not get an overwhelming size.
Yeah.
So I made this new base that I'm excited about. It's very similar to the DNA matches base, and this one is called the Fan Club Research Log. And in genealogy, we have this principle called the FAN principle, and FAN stands for friends, associates, and neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
And often we can't solve a case until we look at all of the friends and people that surrounded a certain ancestor or research subject. And after we look at that and we figure out who they lived next to, who they used as witnesses on deeds, and all that kind of thing, then we can start to see patterns about who they were probably related to, or who they might have migrated with from one state to the next, which is often when our ancestors get lost and we can't figure out where they came from.
Mm-hmm.
So one strategy that I've started using is keeping a table with all of the names of the people I encounter that are related to my ancestor. So here's my research log, and I've kept track of the sources. So I found them on the 1830 census, a tax list, a few deeds. And on each of these records, there's like multiple people that I want to keep track of. So I give them an ID number in my fan club table, and you can see they show up over here.
Mm-hmm.
I love how Airtable links those. And so I can just put in like, oh, this person was the creditor, and this was the neighbor, and this was the witness. And then I sort it by last name and first name, so I can start to see patterns, like this surname Arnett or Arnott maybe was spelled a little bit different, but it's probably the same people because you can see that they have the same first names, Andrew and
Sure.
Jacob. So I'm starting to get an idea that he lived near this family. And maybe if I research this family, I'll find that he married into this family and that's his wife's surname. So it can really help organize these little clues that lead to the answer.
Mm-hmm.
So that's been my new favorite usage for Airtable, because as you can see, there's a lot of people that are coming into contact with the research subject.
Yeah, that's really cool. In that, again, I keep wanting to say detective, but it really is. You have to consider sort of this extra bit of information that you could gather from related information that you're trying to get. So even if you're not necessarily convinced that, say, McKinney was, in your family, you can use their association with your family to kind of get additional information about where they were going, where they went, how long they stayed at a certain place. So it's something I didn't even consider really in part of the research that you'd have to do.
Yeah, it's not one of the concepts that you start off doing when you do your family history research,
Mm-hmm.
but as you get confronted with a brick wall problem in your family tree and you feel like you've come to the end of your line where you just can't push the pedigree back any further, this is a strategy that professional genealogists will use to help extend the pedigree and figure out more details. You know, as you get further back in time, there are less paper records with our ancestors' names on them, but often those names are hidden on records that we wouldn't know to look for until we expand our focus out to the friends, associates, and neighbors. And so that's kind of what's happening here. Like if I went and started researching this John McKinney, maybe I would find that on his will, he actually mentions my research subject, but I wouldn't have known that because usually it would, you know, that record would only be indexed by the person's name. Like the John McKinney's name would be found in the will book index, not the name of all the other people that were mentioned in the will.
Sure. It's also, I'm looking at all of the sources for this information, and it's amazing to me that, you know, 1836 tax list, for instance. So, you know, that was quite some time ago. And, you know, the fact that you're able to glean so much information. I mean, look at all the linked records to this specific tax list. That's incredible.
You know, that's an interesting point. I wasn't sure how much data I wanted to get out of this, but when I really looked at the list, you'll be surprised. I'll show you what the actual handwriting looks like. But when you look at the way it's organized, it's by district. And so all these people were living in a certain part of the county of Tennessee in Hawkins County. And so it's alphabetized, and it's like about 4 pages of people. And I just ultimately decided that I wanted all of their names because I didn't know which ones were his direct neighbors. So I just went for all of them. But you never know which name will end up standing out as being something that shows up in multiple records over, you know, several years.
So I am very clearly not an expert in this at all. I could not read a single word on that page. This is
a pretty poor image copy, actually. It would be easier to read this in person, for sure. So if I were able to go to Hawkins County, Tennessee, actually this would probably be located at the Tennessee State Archives, then it would be easier to read. And it takes practice, but you know, you can zoom in and see a little better and start to get an idea of what these letters are. See how he makes a C?
District number 15, I can see, and like name of person, which I got from context clues,
right,
but the actual name, I can't do it. I mean, the numbers I get 200, 300 and whatnot, but
luckily it's been indexed by somebody who was trying to read these.
Oh, wow.
So they went through and that's how I found it, because I was able to type the name into the database. But sometimes it's wrong. So you just look at this and you compare it and you say, oh yeah, that looks right. And other names like Nicoles, really? You sure it's not Nicoles? Like I think this is probably Nicoles. It looks like a little S there.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I love my job. It's fun to look at these old records and imagine these people who lived so long ago, and they were real people who I kind of feel like their story deserves to be told. So I try to do my best to find all the records about their life and do accurate research. And often it does take a lot of time and research, but ultimately I think it's rewarding, especially when I can cut down on some of the duplication of the data entry,
right,
and start finding real clues to help the client or to help solve the case by finding all these little clues and organizing them in a way that helps me see the information.
Sure. And then at the end of the day, when you've made the conclusions that you were asked to make, or you've solved the question that you've been tasked to solve, I think it would probably come as a relief to, you know, your clients, who not only get an answer, but you'll have all of this information neatly stored and very well organized for them if they wanted to look at, you know, your chain of logic of how you've come to that conclusion. Here you go. Here's all of your research that has been, you know, categorized, and it looks pretty, and it's, you know, you've added citations and links directly to the resource and all of that.
Yes, and there's just so many great capabilities within Airtable to be able to do that. But one of the things that I really need, I don't know if this is possible, but I need to be able to italicize things within my
It's kind of possible. So we'll do it live. If you edit this field that you're in, because it's a long text field, or the field properties.
Okay. Like customize edit.
Yes. Yeah. Customize field type. Then enable rich text formatting. If you exit out of that and do that switch. Yes. Okay. Now save.
Okay.
This is somewhat new of a feature. So now you'll see all of your links became clickable.
That's amazing.
If you open up any of those and you highlight some text now.
Okay. So I need to highlight the yes. You
It's
just
possible.
made my day. You made my day. This is the one feature that I've needed.
You can do it for long text fields, but not, you can't do it with a date field or a single line text field. But long text fields, you can do italics and
hallelujah,
and also bold and clickable links and all that kind of stuff.
The reason this is important, and it might seem silly, but when I'm copying and pasting a citation from Airtable to my report, Chicago manual style, they recommend that you italicize publications. Sure. And so the website is a publication, and then whatever books that I'm citing, those are supposed to be italicized. So it just saves me a step from having to redo the italicized text. Hooray.
I completely understand. And I'm pretty sure that's, one of the, use cases they probably had in mind. Because a lot of people use Airtable to do research. And, when you do research, you should be citing things. And, there's, whether it's APA or Chicago or whomever, there's rules. And so one of them is italics.
This is really the great news. I've been teaching a lot of people about Airtable, and that's been the one thing they're like, oh, but I can't make my citations perfect. So just go back to my spreadsheet. So great news. Wonderful. Thank you, Camille.
No problem. I spend so much time on Airtable. I know what it does. I know all of the tricks, which I feel like I do. And then, every time I host an episode, someone shows me something that I didn't know. So it's a give and take.
Cool. Awesome.
Well, thank you so much for showing all the iterations of this base. This is on, or one of these are on the Airtable Universe, correct?
Yes, I put them both on Airtable Universe. So
great.
If you want to try using the DNA research log, that's been published. And then you can also try the fan club research log template if you want to keep track of all those people that come into contact with your ancestors. The reason why that's important to do is because it's harder to keep track of them in your family tree, because they're not like your cousin or they're not your aunt. They're not in your family tree. They're just people who were living around your ancestor. So you got to put them somewhere. And I think Airtable is a great place.
And logically, with the family tree, there's a set number of people per generation, usually. I mean, you have two parents and your parents have two parents and so on and so forth. But you can have any number of neighbors or other associates. So I imagine that would get very cluttered, and the whole purpose of having a separate base for that.
For sure. Yes.
So, you've set them up very well, where I think even if you didn't necessarily want to do genealogy research for yourself, you've organized them in a way where I think they're pretty adaptable for a bunch of different, sociological research studies that you might do, or anything that you need to keep track of who you've come into contact with when you contacted them. Hats off to you for great base design.
When I first started making this research log for DNA, I didn't have a correspondence log. And one of the people that I shared it with, who was like more of an expert in databases, and he was like, to make this more of a database you can work with, you really should separate out all the correspondence from the matches table and put it into its own table. And that's when a light bulb went off for me that, the power of a database is really being able to sort and group information that relates to these people in so many different ways. So I feel like Airtable has really taught me a lot about how databases work. And as I've started using some other tools for organizing DNA matches and clustering, like Gephi, and visualizing things in network graphs, I've really started to learn more about how databases work. And so it's been a very educational tool for me. I love it. And I'm really glad that it's user-friendly so that someone like me who's not super advanced technologically can figure it out and make it work.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've done a great job, because obviously as you were going through it, I was able to instantly understand what the purpose of each little piece was for, and you've explained it very well, the process that you do, and how you go about making those conclusions. So I want to say thank you so much for sharing this with us, and we'll put a link to each of these bases on the universe in the description, so if anyone wants to use them for themselves, they'll be readily available.
Great, thank you so much.
No problem.